Is free speech important to you? Well, if it is, I hate to break it to you, but it's not very important to the Albanese government. The latest flashpoint comes from Tony Burke, Australia's Home Affairs Minister, the minister who is in charge of things such as immigration, and who gets or doesn't get a visa to enter Australia. He specifically stated, and I quote, "I could not care less about the freedom of speech argument if I'm in the basis of stopping hatred from being imported into Australia." And he specifically claimed that, quote, "social cohesion is what is most important to him." There's just a tiny problem here. The Albanese government doesn't seem to care very much about freedom of speech at all. And it gets worse, because the Albanese government appears to be rather hypocritical about the idea of social cohesion. So let's have a look at this. The government decided to allow in 3,000 people from Gaza into Australia, with barely any security checks. Now, that lack of security checks is a massive problem. They were given tourist visas, and there was seemingly little regard to whether the people coming in support what is clearly a terrorist regime, being Hamas, or another terrorist regime such as that currently rules over Iran. Both regimes have been a thorn in the side of neighbouring countries for years, and Hamas is an officially recognized terrorist organization. One would think that if you're going around supporting such an organization, you potentially could be undermining social cohesion. Or what about the debacle of criminals being let out of jail following a High Court judgment, which the Albanese government should have anticipated that could occur, and they should have planned around when it occurred. But they dropped the ball, seemingly blasé about whether these criminals would reoffend. And lo and behold, many of them did reoffend. And it appears the Albanese government only cares about social cohesion when it suits it. The phrase social cohesion is clearly meaningless. It's vague and it's arbitrary, and it's just used as a weasel word or a cudgel when you're trying to attack someone. If you disagree with the narrative, then you undermine social cohesion. It's clearly a completely meaningless phrase. However, the Albanese government keeps wheeling it out. Now, to be fair, it's also wheeled out by the opposition and various media commentators, by which they mean their freedom of speech disagrees with the ideology they want to promote. I think a pertinent case is that of Ye, formerly known as Kanye West. Ye said some bad things about Jewish Australians, and I don't agree with him. However, he did marry an Australian, and Tony Burke refused him a travel visa into Australia. He was not going to perform nor speak in public. This was going to be a travel visa. The sensible catalyst for denying him a visa was his track entitled Heil Hitler, which people argue promotes Nazism. Now, of course, to be clear, I loathe Nazism and I loathe Hitler. They were racist, socialist, and they were control freaks, and they are beneath contempt. Nazism is clearly a far-left socialist ideology that puts the state at the center of everything. And if you disagree with the state, then you are sent off to the gulags. Nazism is clearly contemptible. But I think that if you listen to the lyrics, then you might get a slightly different story from what was put forward about Ye. Most people don't listen to the lyrics, but they should. His track, in my opinion, is really about isolation, ostracization, and how those can push people into extremism. The track was not about endorsing Hitler. The track was not about endorsing Nazism. The track was not there to glorify them. To give you an idea about why I say this, let's have a look at some of the lyrics. For example, it starts off by saying, "Man, these people took my kids from me, then they froze my bank account. I got so much anger in me, got no way to take it out. Think I'm stuck in the Matrix? Where the fuck's my nitrous? That shit I'm posting on Twitter, they telling me, hey, don't say that. With all the money and fame, I still can't get my kids back. With all the money and fame, I still don't get to see my children. And see my Twitter, but they don't see how I be feeling. So I became a Nazi, yeah, I'm the villain." So in essence, I interpret this as Kanye West showing a lot of anger, and a lot of anger about various things, whether or not it be access to bank accounts, whether or not it be what's going on with his various commercial enterprises, whether or not it's going on with his access to his children, and his slightly messy divorce. Now, some might argue there's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. That is, Kanye West was very controversial, and in particular did seem to come out and say things that were anti-Semitic. And then he suffered these repercussions. But then it built upon itself, and it exacerbated, and it effectively became a situation where it was self-perpetuating, with Kanye West feeling more and more isolated and therefore becoming more and more extreme. So like you said, he became the villain, and it's almost as if he became more and more extreme and more and more villainous, so to speak, because he felt more and more isolated. I think that's what he's trying to convey with this song, rather than necessarily an adoration for Hitler. However, I will note that given his prior interviews, that certainly is open to interpretation. Another area to focus on is the chorus, where it says, N Heil Hitler, N Heil Hitler. They don't understand the things I say on Twitter, N Heil Hitler. They don't understand the things I say on Twitter, all my N's Nazis, N Heil Hitler. So let's just unpackage that a little bit. He's saying that his N's, so that would effectively be black people, are Nazis. Now that clearly is a cognitive dissonance, given that the Nazis were infamously racist and didn't particularly like black people. So squaring the two together doesn't really work. I.e., you can't really be black and also a Nazi, or at least it wouldn't be logical to do so. So I think that cognitive dissonance is helping to drive home the point. He's trying to drive home not necessarily that he's a Nazi, or necessarily that he supports Hitler, but he believes that he's become somewhat villainous and perhaps somewhat excoriated, and he seems to believe unfairly so. Now, an area of controversy is that at the very end of the song, he samples a portion of a speech from Adolf Hitler, which says, if you consider the work that I'm doing be right, if you think that I have been diligent, that I have worked, that I have advocated for you this year, that I have spent my time honestly in the service of my people, then cast your vote. If so, then stand up for me like I have stood up for you. Now, that clearly misses a lot of context about the totality of Adolf Hitler as a person. That quote itself, in and of itself, is not per se a problem. Rather, the issue, of course, is all of the other things that Adolf Hitler did. In that specific portion of the speech is saying that, well, if you think that I've fought for you, well, then stand up and vote for me. After all, remember, this is 1936, where to some extent, well, there still was a bit of a democracy before Adolf Hitler effectively entirely seized control. Now, Ye's point probably would have been stronger if he didn't sample that portion of Hitler's speech. However, there's probably a couple of reasons for doing so. Either it could have been that Ye does in fact support Hitler, and/or it could have been that Ye was trying to make a point about the nature of that speech. He was basically trying to say that if I've been working so hard for you, don't just turn on me in an instant. If you've enjoyed all of my music and now I'm going through troubles, don't just leave me immediately. Don't be, I guess, a fair weather friend, is kind of what he's trying to get at. However, again, that's open to interpretation. So this is the reason I think that Ye's track is more complex than it's sometimes made out to be. But of course, I'll acknowledge it is open to interpretation, and certainly many other people have taken a stance that the song does in fact praise Hitler. Perhaps I'm being generous to Ye, but that's how I interpreted the track. Maybe you disagree with my interpretation, however. In any case, I want to be very clear here. My stance on Ye is about how I view what his track intends, and what I think he's trying to say. I don't agree with, nor condone, nor support Nazism or Hitler, both of which I think are beneath contempt. Regardless, if they're going to ban Ye, then they really need to be consistent. They should also ban anyone who supports the Ayatollah in Iran, because the Ayatollah has called for the destruction of Israel, which would also suggest the Ayatollah is equally as bad as Hitler, because he is equally as anti-Semitic. At least, that's how I see it. And judging from how prominently the Ayatollah's portrait was displayed at recent protests, it seems the government is actually apathetic toward this. It seems the government is very inconsistent about policing anti-Semitism. The government will crack down on perceived anti-Semitism when it suits it. However, they seemingly turn a blind eye when it is impolitic to call it out. Of course, it's not just the Albanese government that had called out Ye about this. Many media and commentators had also done so, and perhaps the government was feeling the media pressure. I want to also point out that if the Albanese government actually cares about social cohesion, well then the Albanese government needs to take a look in the mirror, because they've been doing as much to undermine social cohesion as anyone else. This includes through the divisive voice referendum, which prima facie would have entrenched racial discrimination into the Constitution by enabling funding, access, and therefore power to one group of people on the basis of race. It clearly would have divided people up. That very literally undermines social cohesion. But then there's also their latent class warfare, where Albanese and Chalmers seem intent on seizing assets. This is very clear from Division 296, which would impose a tax on unrealized gains. That tax would mean that if your assets just go up with inflation, then the government can seize a slice of it. It's truly troubling to say we get hyperinflation and say everything goes up in price just due to inflation occurring. Then the assets will also go up in price. So say inflation happens to run at 10% and your $100 worth of shares goes up to $110. We haven't actually gotten any wealthier, you've just seen inflation occur. But the government is then going to come and seize a portion of that inflation. So basically you're getting whacked with inflation and then whacked with tax. The government is seizing assets from you simply due to inflation. It's truly baffling to me that they think this is a good idea. But not only that, the ideological support of Fabian socialism is the biggest threat to democracy, in my opinion, because it's tantamount to a tyranny of the majority. It's tantamount to a bare majority of people being able to seize the assets, to rob the assets of targeted minorities. And here, that majority can be as little as 51%, or in our case currently, 54% of the two-party preferred vote and 34% of the primary vote. And that is what is enabling them to go and steal people's assets. That is what Fabian socialism amounts to. And in my opinion, that is the biggest threat to democracy, because it basically tells us that if democracy amounts to 34% of people being able to steal your assets, then really, what does it actually amount to? But of course, if you question the government, then the government seemingly wants to silence you, as very clear from their aborted misinformation and disinformation bill, which thankfully failed to pass Parliament. Again telling us they don't really care about social cohesion, they care about controlling the narrative. The Albanese government itself is undermining social cohesion, but you can let me know your thoughts about them in the comments below.